Welcome to our presentation on pre-registering NLP research. This presentation is meant to get a discussion started at this conference on how we can incorporate pre-registration in our daily research. This was a collaboration with Chris van der Lee and Emil Kramer. The background to all of this is that there's been a lot of news about the replication crisis in science. This is the idea that many published results aren't actually replicable or reproducible. So following the steps outlined in the papers, we actually don't get the same results. So the question is, how can we improve our ways? How can we improve science here so that most of our work is reproducible? Well, in 2017, Munafo et al. Published their Manifesto for Reproducible Science, and they make 4 recommendations. The first of them is more methodological training, the second is diversifying peer review, the third is adopting reporting guidelines, and the fourth is pre-registration. Well, the natural question here is, do we see any follow-ups in NLP? How are we doing? Well, on the first point, I think we're doing quite well. There's recently been much more attention to statistics, so determining which model is significantly better than the other. There's been a lot of work on human evaluation, on dataset quality, on interpretability, and there are also regular tutorials at our big ACL, NAACL, EACL conferences. So we're doing quite well here. The second point is diversifying peer review. And I think as an NLP field, we're at the forefront of science here. We embrace many different ways to publish our work. And we have many different venues with different kinds of peer review. So you can publish your paper on archives so that it's immediately out there in the open. There's open review, but there's also double-blind reviewing at other conferences, and we also have journals with a more intensive reviewing process. And next to that, there are also discussions and tutorials on how people should actually review papers. So ACL, I think, recently had a tutorial geared towards graduate students on how to review a paper. The third point is to adopt reporting guidelines. And I think as a field, we're also doing quite well here. Recently, there's been much more attention also to reproducibility checklists and also things like data statements, model cards, and data sheets that give us a lot of detail about what our data looks like and how our models were trained and what their architecture is like. We've also become a bit more reflective as a field recently. So, and you can see that in one example through the ethical considerations that are now added to the end of papers submitted to this conference. And finally, there's pre-registration, but we hardly see any discussion on pre-registration in NLP. And also, we tried to find pre-registrations in NLP, and we found 2 in the entire ACL anthology. So very few people, if anyone at all, publishes pre-registrations. So what are pre-registrations? Simply put, pre-registration is the practice of specifying what you're going to do and what you expect to find in your study before carrying out the study. So the basic idea is that you pre-register a study by filling in a pre-registration form. This form asks you about your hypotheses and your approach, so that you specify all the details of how you're actually going to try and answer your research question. And this form is either public or private, and you can decide. And then later on, once you finished your results, if the form was private, you can make it public with a click of a button. And pre-registrations are timestamped, so you can use them as evidence that you started on this, or that you pre-registered your study ahead of actually carrying out the study. So why would you pre-register your study? Well, in NLP, as in many other fields, there are a lot of ways to analyze our data, and also there are many ways, once the results are in, that you can explain your results. And if you don't pre-register, and if you don't think about this beforehand, then you can actually sort of experiment and find the analysis that gives you the best results, or sort of tweak the vague kind of hypothesis that you had in the back of your head to get a convincing stories. In other words, we have two dimensions in which there's a lot of leeway to do whatever we like to get a convincing story. But that leeway also means that our research is less reliable because it could just be coincidence. So if you wanted to pre-register, what would a pre-registration form look like? Well, there's in psychological science, there's been a lot of work on developing these kinds of forms. So for quantitative studies, there's questions like the status. So has any data been collected for this study already? And typically for a true pre-registration, the answer should be no. You should pre-register your work before any data has been collected. For NLP, this is a bit more difficult because we often work with existing corpora. But you could argue that the outputs of our models are not in yet, right, before we start our studies. So in a way, the data is also not collected yet. Then the hypotheses. So what is the main question being asked, or what are the hypotheses that are being tested in this study? The dependent variable. So if you say that some feature X causes Y to change, then what is Y? How do you define it? How are you going to measure it? So your pre-registration form asks you to describe this dependent variable. And then in experimental studies, the form asks, okay, how many and which conditions will participants be assigned to? In NLP, we don't always have participants, perhaps people in a human evaluation count, but otherwise you could think about different kinds of models that you want to compare. So describe those in detail. And then what kinds of analyses will you carry out to examine the main question or hypothesis? These are things that you can just specify in advance so that you reduce this leeway that you have and try to make sure that you'll just carry out the study as you wanted to originally, and then afterwards you're confronted with these ideas that you had beforehand. And then outliers and exclusions. So if you find outliers, how will you deal with them? The sample size. So can you provide how many people or how many data points will you collect? And how will you determine the sample size? What's your motivation for collecting this many? And finally, there's just a general catch-all question. So is there anything else you'd like to pre-register? No. This is just a quantitative pre-registration form, but other forms have been proposed. So there's also a pre-registration form for more qualitative studies, such as interviews or focus groups. And this particular form comes from aspredicted.org. So what about NLP? Well, we believe that almost any NLP study could be pre-registered. So we've looked at the different paper types from introduced at Coling 2018. So computationally aided linguistic analysis, we think could be pre-registered, as could an NLP engineering experiment paper, or a reproduction study where the hypothesis is basically that you get the same results with the approach proposed in a paper. And you could think about in advance how much effort you're willing to spend to reproduce the original results. Will you contact the authors, yes or no? These kinds of things. And more generally, you could think about pre-registering the hypotheses or research questions, your approach, the kind of sampling that you will perform, how you will analyze the data, how you will evaluate the results, and so on. These are things that you could state up front. And then we have resource papers and survey papers. And for those, you don't really have hypotheses, but you do have a particular research aim, some expectation about what you think you'll find through your work. And you can also state your approach beforehand, and the sampling as well, and the analyses that you plan to carry out. Here you could also specify the motivations behind your work so that if you pivot towards another application later on, you'll have to confront this question of, okay, does this original goal actually influence what you can do with this corpus, for example? Now, finally, position papers. I don't think a pre-registration makes a lot of sense here. But the other papers, we believe that you could pre-register them, and we should have a discussion on what should be the elements in a pre-registration form for these kinds of studies. Now, the next concept that I want to introduce is registered reports. So registered reports are like peer-reviewed pre-registrations that guarantee publication if the pre-registration is approved and if the study has been carried out according to plan, and otherwise unexpected changes to the plan are clearly indicated. So you can deviate from your original plan, but then you need to explain how you deviated and why you deviated from this original plan. And this has many advantages. There's a more constructive reviewing process because reviewers can still comment on the setup of your study before you've carried it out, so you can adapt your setup. There's less hassle to publish upon completion of the study because the design has already been approved. And also you can take your time. And I think this is a very important point. So is this the future of NLP publishing? Well, we don't expect everyone to start pre-registering their studies from now on, but we do recommend that you try it out. So there are some downsides, and we should emphasize that pre-registration doesn't offer any guarantees regarding paper quality and reliability. So a pre-registered paper is not more reliable than a not pre-registered paper. It's still about the execution. But we believe it's still helpful for the reasons listed below. And it also does introduce some overhead at the start of the research process, but you need to write everything down anyway. Pre-registration is a very useful tool to stay honest with yourself, so to confront yourself with your original ideas when you started out with this research. And doing this kind of thing in advance might save you time because you really need to think through your work. How are you going to do this? What will you measure? What is the motivation behind all of this? And finally, registered reports could help support slow science in NLP because once your pre-registration has been approved, you can take your time. And I think this allows us to be more reflective, to be more thoughtful in our work. And I think we should really give pre-registration a chance. Having that said, there are still some open questions. For example, what should pre-registration forms look like? For which paper type should we consider registered reports? For all of them, or are there some papers that are probably more, where it's probably more relevant to consider a registered report? Could pre-registration forms themselves form a separate publication type, so similar to medical protocols that are also published? And you could maybe cite them already, even though the results are not in yet, because you want to copy their methodology, for example. And there are many more questions. So that was my brief overview of pre-registration in NLP research. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the paper, and if you have any questions, you can contact me through the details listed on this slide.